Thanks very much, Sue, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody. It's great to see so many of the people in this room. So I'm a conventional doctor by trade. I was professor of rheumatology at the University of Bristol for about 100 years. Before I sort of moved into the witchcraft area, as David described it. And, you know, it's a funny business because in the medical profession, we don't really do caring and healing anymore. We're just body mechanics. And we're taught how to be body mechanics. And we're about the first time in history that the medical profession, sanctioned by society, has not actually had caring and healing as a central part of what it does. In all other cultures and in all other times, healing and caring have been thought to be central to any system of healthcare, and yet modern biomedicine describes it as witchcraft. And that's an extraordinary thing, and I'm very keen. I'm one of a moderately small number of doctors, but there are others of us who are very keen to see that integration come back, to see healing and caring back in the centre of healthcare alongside biomedicine. That's not to diss biomedicine. It's been very good for lots of things, but it doesn't achieve everything. It's not the whole answer to all of healthcare, and we need to reintegrate. Now, my profession does dismiss things like healing generally because it can't understand it within its materialistic biomedical sense of the world. So because we can't detect and measure the things that might be facilitating healing, we don't believe in it, which is a very arrogant position. But we do believe in clinical trials. Clinical trials have reached some sort of pinnacle of almost religious belief. So one way of making some impact here and convincing the medical profession is to show that the clinical trials on healing show some benefit. Now, I'm going to upset Chris Rowe now by telling you that I don't think clinical trials is the way forward for healing, but it's a way forward, and it's a way of us trying to get back some respect, I think, of things like healing within my own biomedical profession. So I'm absolutely delighted as a member of the CHO that we were able to fund this work in an excellent department in Northampton who've done a really top-rate, rigorous piece of research that passes all the tick boxes of scientific rigor and methodological appropriateness as a way of looking at trials on healing, and Chris is going to tell you the results of that in a minute, and they are positive. So I'm really hoping that this is the start of us trying to bridge that gap that I'm so keen to bridge. Just briefly to finish, to tell you that we are doing other things within the CHO, within research. This is not the only thing we're doing. One other problem that we're trying to tackle at the moment is the concept that things like healing are fringe activities. My medical colleagues tell me, oh yeah, well that's just a fringe thing, one or two people, it's not a big thing. Well, it is a big thing, and we can show it's a big thing in various ways, and we're involved in some surveys. We are conducting surveys amongst healers, and we're planning a survey, a population survey, later this year to try and just demonstrate the size of this and the fact that many of the public are voting with their feet and using healing alongside many other complementary therapies alongside biomedicine. And we're also hoping to do more work alongside Chris and his group because reviews of the literature are an important way forward, but we don't just want to know the numerical answer to does it work or doesn't it, which in some ways is a slightly dumb question. We want to know, and we want to answer a more sophisticated question of who does it work for and in what circumstances. And that requires a different approach to literature called realist research approach, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to take that forward. Chris and I have been talking about that for a little while now, but haven't actually got it funded and happening yet, but we hope to in the future. So this is hopefully just the start of more research in this country on healing to complement that that's going on in the US and elsewhere to get us back having healing and caring at the centre of healthcare. So without more ado, the main act now is Chris to tell you on behalf of his colleagues Charmaine and Elizabeth about the research done, funded by the CHO. Thank you, Chris.
As Paul says, my name is Chris Rowe. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Northampton. I'm also the director of the Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes, or CSAP from now on. CSAP is particularly interested in exceptional human experiences and claims of exceptional beliefs that seem to go beyond our ordinary or current scientific understanding of the nature of what it is to be a human being. We're particularly railing against the idea that the scientific intelligentsia dismiss these as pseudoscience, despite the fact that typically a significant number of people report these beliefs and these experiences, and they are readily amenable to scientific investigation. And our strategy is to treat them seriously, but to test them and scrutinise them in the most thoroughgoing way that we possibly can. As part of that effort, we approached the CHO to ask if they might be interested in us conducting a thorough review of evidence that relates to claims of non-contact healing. We're glad to say that after a little bit of negotiation, the CHO were pleased to support this project and enable it to take place. It's important to stress that the CHO did not interfere at any stage in the process. We were able to work completely independently, and the findings were as much a surprise for them as for other people when they were reported when we started to write the papers for those. It's really important to stress that although this project was supported, it was conducted completely independently throughout. The work wasn't conducted by myself alone, and my two colleagues here from CSAP were also involved. So it's with particular thanks to Shami Sonex, who was the project manager for the project and managed the day-to-day business, and to Liz Roxburgh, who was particularly responsible for helping with the design stage and the writing up stage. So all the good bits are my responsibility, and all the bad bits, you can ask those two questions, those bits later. So we don't have particular expertise in healing, but we're interested in this range of anomalous experiences, and we think that the scientific method can be applied to them to understand whether there is a case to be made. We took our definition of healing from Edzard Ernst, who describes it as the interaction between one individual, a healer, not particularly popular in this room, I guess, and a second or sick individual with the intention of bringing about an improvement or cure of the illness. The kinds of phenomena that fall under this category include energy healing, Reiki, Joe Ray, therapeutic touch, distant healing, shamanic healing, spiritual healing, intercessionary prayer, and non-directed prayer. So that's quite an eclectic mix. And what they seem to have in common is that focus or intention, positive intention towards another person or biological system, and an expectation that that biological system will respond positively. They'll experience some sense of well-being or improvement. Given that it's quite an eclectic mix, we shouldn't necessarily presume that there will be a common mechanism underlying all of these, that they all will work, that they will all work in the same way, or that they will work with the same populations. And I think that was an important feature of what we wanted to explore in conducting this review. We're impressed with the personal testimonials that people give based on their experience of healing in its various forms. Many people do, in an anecdotal way, report improvement in their condition, and we can see that they're very popular. However, it's important to distinguish that these positive outcomes might be explained in other ways and don't really constitute scientific evidence. And in particular, we're concerned about the effects that we already know of in relation to things like expectancy and placebo effects that can produce positive change in people, but isn't due to the intervention per se, or due to other aspects. And there might also be hidden factors that we're not aware of in a real-world situation that we can more effectively control under laboratory or clinical testing situations. So our model here was to focus on studies that used the clinical approach, the clinical trial approach. And these are particularly important in ruling against or guarding against those counter-explanations, so that they're better controlled for the idea that placebo might be operational. So this involves, for example, the creation of a comparison condition, a group of people who don't experience the intervention, so we can map to see how that condition might change over time anyway, due to other causes. A random allocation of people to one group or the other to ensure that there isn't any kind of systematic bias in the selection of clients. People who might be just on the brink of improving anyway for a variety of other reasons, or maybe more susceptible to placebo-like effects. It's crucial that the allocation to an active or a comparison condition is randomly determined. The blinding of participants. We need to control whether participants know that they're receiving genuine treatment or that they're receiving a control, a sugar pill equivalent. And it's crucial that we have conditions in place that prevent that blind from being lifted, to So we have to make sure that whatever people experience in the comparison condition is equivalent in many ways, that people can't work out for themselves that this isn't genuine Reiki, this isn't genuine non-contact healing. Blinding of those they encounter as well. It's very easy for people to communicate the condition that people have been allocated to very subtly and unwittingly. So it's important that those people that interact with the patients or the clients also don't know which condition they've been allocated to. And finally, those people who are evaluating the outputs, so the health outcomes that are measured, they also need to be measured by people who at that time are blind, don't know whether this person is in the active condition or in the comparison condition. So those are the kind of features that we were looking for in the published clinical record. And our task was to bring all of those studies together, so not producing any new data, but actually collating the data that's already on the public record, and to see what sense we could make of that. Is there a case to answer? Do there seem to be beneficial effects in being in a healing condition compared with a control condition? And does that exhibit any systematic pattern or change depending on conditions? Okay. The other things that informed our intentions or aims for the current project were, firstly, that there have been a number of early reviews of healing studies, and these have generally given a positive outcome. There does seem to be an effect, but they've generally criticised the methodological quality of the studies that have been conducted to date. Now, we might presume that since the 80s, methodological rigour has improved, so we might expect standards to have improved. So that opens the question, what happens over time? As we tighten up the methodological protocols, do we find that the effects disappear because they're simply artifacts, they're kind of weaknesses in the design, or do we find that the effects today are as robust as they were 20 years ago? Many studies have been conducted since then. Some of these have been very high profile, some successful replications, but also some failures to replicate those effects. And we want to see how they affect the database overall. How does that change the weight of evidence that we have before us? And also, importantly, some of those earlier studies have now been discredited, and it's important to conduct a new review that excludes those completely, so that we have a more conservative estimate, but one that we can have more confidence in as being a reliable indicator of whether there is a real-world effect. We're also concerned that studies that involve what we call whole humans, which sounds a bit gruesome, may not always be effective because participants always have intentions and expectations when they know that they're participating in studies, such that even if they're in a controlled condition in actual fact, they may act as if they're in the active condition. If you ask people on debrief, they typically report that they believe that they were in the active condition. It's kind of human nature, I suppose. And that clearly can add psychological factors to what's going on. And we wanted to find a way that we might be able to control those expectancy effects as well, to remove those, to set those aside. So what we proposed at the CHO was that we would conduct 2 reviews rather than 1. The first of those would be a whole human review, so those studies that work with real people, clients and patients, but a second review that focused on other biological systems that might not be subject to the same biases. So here we're talking about animal models, plant studies, but also human tissue. And in each of those cases, sadly for some of the mice in these studies, we might not have the expectation that they've got friends and family members who are also praying for them as they're undergoing their recovery. They have fewer expectations about being in a study and what the consequences of that might be. And so here we have a kind of a cleaner analysis and assay of whether there can be healing effects. So we wanted to look at those 2 databases quite separately. To gather together the studies that we would review, we used a number of academic databases. This doesn't include PubMed, which is the standard one, but we have a variety here. And since the date of the review, we've gone back to PubMed and conducted the same kind of review, and we weren't able to identify any additional studies. So we used keywords to identify studies that were potentially of interest. We also then conducted references searches. So each paper that we secured, we would look through the references of those papers as well to see if there were further studies that we might have missed. And we also tried to access the grey literature, studies which were not yet fully published, by contacting authors of those studies to ask if there were other papers, other completed studies that would be relevant to our project. And we included those in the analysis. Now this produces a large array of studies, many of which are not suitable to a meta-analysis. So what we wanted to do in our review was to conduct a mathematical summary. So to combine together the outcomes of various different studies to see what the overall outcome is across those studies. Many of the studies that we secured using the code words or the keywords involve, for example, other surveys, individual cases that were presented, might include qualitative studies that weren't really suitable for this project. We also wanted to exclude studies where the target wasn't a biological system. So there are a number of publications out there, for example, that look at the effects of human intention on electrical systems, for example, computers, things like that, or other mechanical systems. There are some studies also that look at effects on physical systems, such as water, for example, and the ways in which water might freeze. So they were not included in this study because they didn't represent biological systems per se. There must be a healing intention or an obvious link to health and well-being in these studies. So that allowed us to exclude studies where you're trying to affect another person's behaviour, for example, but you're not actually attempting to send them any kind of positive change to their health or well-being. So this might include, for example, a tranche of staring detection studies, where people were attempting to see whether focused attention from one person could be detected or responded to by another person. The healing conducted must not include direct touching. There's a small literature that suggests that direct touching in itself can be therapeutic, and we wanted to exclude that as a possible explanation if we were to find a significant overall outcome. We only looked at studies published in English because that was the only language we were proficient in. And the studies must include sufficient data to allow for an effect size calculation. So they must report statistics in the outcome. There's a little caveat to that which I'll explain later. Through that process, we identified 61 whole human studies. So studies that used a person as a patient or client as a subject of interest, and 49 studies fitted into that more gruesome category of non-whole human. So animal and plant models, but also biological tissue. We were interested to see if there was a relationship between the outcome and the quality, the methodological quality of the studies. But again, it's important that that assessment is made blind, not knowing the outcome of that study. So Shani worked really hard to produce blinded versions of each of the published papers by blocking out personally identifying information. This shows this, there we are over here. And providing 3 judges with just the methodological details. And the judges then evaluated that material based on its methodological competence. They judged it in 2 different ways. One, in a holistic, rather subjective way. They simply gave it a rating out of 10 based on the sense that they felt that this was a very secure, very valid, well-controlled study where the outcome was secure, we could have confidence in, through to 0 where there were too many flaws or errors or ambiguities in the way the study was explained or described, and we'd have real concern about taking on trust the claimed outcome. We also wanted to analyse or break down the methodology into more detail, and for that we used the Sign 50 scale. We can tell you more about that a little bit later, which is essentially a clinical measure that allows us to look at the efficacy of various forms of clinical intervention. It's particularly used by the Scottish NHS to evaluate interventions that it might want to make use of. And for it, we were able to look at various categories of the methodology in different ways to see if maybe some of those were particularly influential in affecting the outcome. Onto the data. So the first task is to change the outcome. Outcomes are reported in various statistical ways, but these days it's possible to convert them to a common statistic, one that allows us to make direct comparisons between one study and another study. And these are represented as the dots on this graph here. The crucial thing to remember is that where there is no effect in a study, where the people in the healing condition fare just the same as the people in the control condition, that gives us an effect size of exactly 0. So we'd expect those to fall bang on the line down the middle here. You'll see that there are quite a few studies that fall exactly on that 0 point, and that's because conservatively, anytime a study simply reported that the outcome was non-significant and gave no further detail, we gave that a rating of exactly 0, that the scores were identical. But you'll see that many of the studies give quite varied outcomes. Some of them are extremely positive, so all of these on this side of the graph indicate that, at least by a little margin, people in the active condition fared better than people in the control condition. But there's a lot of variability here, and in fact these study outcomes are significantly heterogeneous. So that means they seem to be measuring different things. Statistically, that's a problem, and what we want to do is to refine those data in some way. There may be some systematic methodological problem, for example, with some of them that's contributing to those outcomes. So we can use a mathematical procedure to hone down, to remove some of the outliers, and end up with a more consistent or coherent picture, which presumably better reflects the real world situation. And when we do that with these studies, when we weight them by sample size, and we take out the outliers, we end up with an overall effect size down here, which is 0.193. So that, of course, means very little to us. That's a small effect size. It means that this is the kind of effect that may not be small in terms of its real-world implications, but it's the kind of size of an effect that we wouldn't ordinarily see just by the naked eye, that we need statistics in order to identify that something non-ordinary, extra chance has occurred in our study. The studies are also weighted, as I mentioned, by sample size, because the larger the study, the better it will approximate the real-world effect size. With very small studies, they're subject to all sorts of biases, particularly sampling error, and that's where you get a lot of noise down the bottom typically in these kinds of distributions. Ordinarily, what we'd ideally like to see when we plot out the data points like this is a kind of a funnel shape should appear, so that the scores that appear with the very large sample sizes tend to be clustered quite closely together, and as you move down and you've got the relatively small studies down the bottom, that's where you get a greater diffusion as the subject more to that sampling error. And in this study, what we'd expect to see are more studies over in this area here. Even if there is a real effect, and here we've got an overall effect size that's nearly 0.2, we'd expect some of the studies to still be reporting no difference in their particular study. And this to us looks as if there's a publication bias, that some people may have been conducting studies and when they discovered that they haven't worked out, they've not gone on to publish those. However, that isn't enough to counterbalance the effect that we do see here. There is an overall effect. When we review the quality ratings, the blinded quality ratings that we gathered and relate those to the outcome, what we find is that some of those do correlate negatively with the outcome. That means as the methodological feature improves in quality, so the effect size goes down. And we might be suspicious that that suggests that at least some part of the effect is due to those shortcomings in the way people have designed their research. So we have a number of those, and that includes also the overall quality rating, which is nearly significant. So just based on that subjective estimate, those scores out of 10, we're getting a negative relationship there. The studies that were rated overall as not quite as well conducted as some of the other studies have overall tended to give better outcomes. However, fortunately, with things like meta-analysis, we don't need to leave it there. We can actually explore that a little bit more thoroughly. And in this case, what we did was, we looked at the average quality ratings of the studies, which was quite low, it's only around about the midpoint, and we selected out only those studies that met minimum threshold standards, that we would be satisfied meant that the studies were competently conducted. And among just those studies that met that threshold, we actually find that the effect size improves a little bit. And so those remaining studies, the kind of gold standard among this database, they're giving evidence of an effect, that the people in the healing condition are faring better than those in a control or comparison condition. Under those conditions where they don't know which condition they're in, the people who are evaluating the data are also blinded and so on. When we broke that down to look at whether different forms of healing intention or practice have differential effects, we were able to split this database into 4 different categories. We had some studies which involved intercessionary prayer, some that were identified as Reiki and Jo Ray techniques. We clustered those together. They share some similarities. And therapeutic touch, which is also similar in some respects, but we felt is also rather different, for example, in what you might call the treatment or exposure time. It's different in that way. And a kind of a catch-all category at the end, unspecified other studies. Some studies didn't really tell us very much at all about the technique that was used to introduce healing. The way to read this graph is that the dots indicate the overall or average effect size within that cluster, and the bar here represents the confidence interval. We're very confident that the real-world effect falls somewhere in that range. And importantly, for none of these does that line cut through the 0 point. So each of these, independently or separately, is significant. It means that we can't explain those outcomes just in terms of chance fluctuations. Something else is going on that we need to explain. And that applies to intercessionary prayer as it applies to the others. Now, the effect size for prayer is a little bit lower than the others, and that may be due to that treatment being a little bit more diffuse. Those studies typically use many more participants to be the healers. They don't dictate to the same degree the nature of the intervention, so how one should pray, and for how often, what the dosage should be, and so on. And that could be one of the factors that affects that. But overall, these lines, these effect sizes overlap sufficiently that we can still conclude that these are really reflecting different aspects of the same phenomenon. So we went on then to do a similar thing for the non-whole human studies. So these are the mice and the monkeys and the skin abrasions and things like that. And for the database here, we can see a similar kind of picture. This time the funnel is a little bit more complete. On this occasion there are some negative studies. But again, we feel that there are probably some missing studies down here. That there are probably some studies that use non-whole humans that were unsuccessful, that haven't been published. Again, there aren't a sufficient number of those to counterbalance the picture that we see. We think there is an overall effect that needs to be explained and cannot be explained simply in terms of chance or conventional explanations as we might currently apply them.
When we look at the quality ratings again, we see that some of the same factors relate to the outcome. So again, there are a concerning number of negative correlations that suggest that might be at least an element of the effect, the outcome, is due to weaknesses in the way the studies are designed. But the overall quality rating is very sound. And again, when we select out only the best of those studies, we again see that although the effect size is diminished a little bit in this case, it is still significant. So if we only selected the very best quality studies that work with non-whole humans, they are showing an effect that cannot be explained simply in terms of chance. On this occasion, we didn't really have enough data to be able to break down our analysis by healing type, so instead we broke it down by target system. And so we separated out our animal studies from the plant studies, from the in vitro type studies. And what we find here is that again there's really quite a large overlap between the three different types. There doesn't seem to be a substantial difference between the two, but it's the cell culture type studies that seems to have the slightly largest effect. And we wondered whether that might be due to the fact that those systems are a little bit simpler and are much less likely to experience homeostasis. So kind of checks and balances that can readjust after a healing intervention has nudged things a little bit. It might kind of nudge back again, back to its original position. So our conclusions. There is a significant combined effect size that is suggestive of a non-contact healing effect in the data published thus far. Oh, that isn't me, that one. Heterogeneous effect sizes, so the diversity in the outcomes, which isn't what we'd expect statistically, and some negative association with study quality needs to be accounted for. So I think there's some concern that some studies may be capturing some noise as well because of the way those studies have been conducted. However, restricting the review to the better quality studies, as we've seen, actually does not eradicate the effect. It doesn't disappear. So if we only look at the gold standard studies, there is still something that needs to be explained. Blocking suggests some differences in effects for different systems, but we need more data to really be assured as to what that might be. Finally, where do we go from here? Well, of course, most academics at this point say further research is necessary, and this is where we get our cap out and walk around the room. But I think it certainly is, and I think in particular what we need to see is a more rigorous and systematic approach to research. I think people need to adopt fixed standards, consensusly agreed standards as to how such work should be conducted and what shortcomings they should avoid. And I look forward to the next tranche of studies which hopefully take into account these recommendations. So the kind of things we're talking about, some of them are methodological. We need a very clearly circumscribed population with explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we need to know what health condition is supposed to be treated and who would qualify to be a recipient of the treatment, and in particular to relate that to the healer's own claims. With random allocation, there needs to be an assessment that random allocation is effective. What we typically do is we have patients who are allocated to one condition or another by an electronic toss of the coin, but that's no guarantee that there aren't systematic differences in those groups in terms of, for example, age, socioeconomic status, comorbidity features, and it's important to actually check those at the very beginning so that any progression in the disease can be related to those factors as well. We need to have explicit selection criteria for the healers themselves and not assume that a healer will be able to operate under any circumstances with any target biological system. We need to marry those two together, and one of the main lessons we want to give to the community is the idea that there needs to be closer collaboration. The researchers need to understand practice better, and practitioners possibly need to know a little bit more about research and how research is conducted. We need to ensure a homogeneity of approach across healers, and that certainly isn't the case when it comes to some of the intercessionary prayer studies. And we need to pre-specify the primary outcomes. Some of these studies have this general sense that people are going to get well without identifying which criteria they're going to work to. And it's really important to set that down in advance to avoid accusations that we're cherry picking after the fact only those parameters that seem to work, and we're discreetly forgetting about all of the others. And that, in a nutshell, is all I'd like to tell you today. Thanks for your attention.